This is Going Underground. I'm Afshin Ratansi. In today's show, was it just the drugs that forced a coalition minister to resign? And Band Aid's new single is destined for the #1 spot tomorrow, but will the proceeds kill more people than they save? News came this week that Julian Assange is not going to walk free just yet, but what does this mean for WikiLeaks and Britain? We speak to Julian's lawyer. All this and more on today's Going Underground. The Health and Social Care Information Centre's national statistics for drug misuse in the UK won't be published for another 10 days, but it was the publication of the government's first evidence-based study into drug use and drug laws at the end of October that led to the shock resignation of the Home Office Minister of State for Crime Prevention. Joining me now is Norman Baker, the Lib Dem MP and former minister at the heart of the uproar. Welcome, Norman, to Going Underground. So let's just recap, really. Why is it that you resigned?
Well, I resigned for a number of reasons. I actually wanted the break. 4.5 years in the ministerial office is quite a long time, longer than most people have, as a matter of fact. And if you're the only Lib Dem in the department, having to cover the whole department for your party, and you're in the department which is probably the cutting edge of the coalition, the Home Office, and you've got Conservatives who want to stop you doing what you should be doing, that's quite a challenge for any minister.
Why is there only one Lib Dem MP in the Home Office, such an important, critical department as regards the coalition?
Because the Lib Dems took the view in 2010 that we would spread our resources across as many departments as possible to make sure we had a voice everywhere. And the arithmetic in Parliament is that there are roughly 6 Conservatives to 1 Lib Dem, so we are outnumbered in every department.
Now, we had one of the world's leading neuropharmacologists, David Nutt, who resigned as a scientific advisor for a previous government. He told us that it's all right it's understandable governments may not like scientific advice, but when it comes to democratically elected ministers who can't even get evidence looked at by a department, that's another matter. What do you think?
Well, I got evidence looked at. We had the international comparator study which my party commissioned and which I forced publication of against the wishes of my Conservative colleagues who would rather the thing were buried. It came out, it was a very good report, it was written by civil servants, not by me, and I think the genie's out of the bottle.
So why did they want to bury it?
I think it's inconvenient because it demonstrates that the evidence from other countries suggests that the approach taken by the UK is not ideal in all regards, and that a health-based approach is more effective at reducing drug use than a punitive approach which some countries, including Russia, have adopted.
Is it that sense in the Home Office that ministers and politicians and advisors feel it is the tabloids are running the policy? Because privately, presumably, they understand, forget about the 60s, you know, this is about hundreds of thousands of people's lives, it's about the criminal justice system, it's about the deficit even.
Well, I think there's a feeling from my Conservative colleagues that they were doing the right thing. I'm sure they were well motivated, and I'm sure also that they were conscious of the impact there would be if they took a substantially different line and the dangers that would present to them politically, both in their own party and elsewhere. I mean, I think
when you say elsewhere, do you mean the media?
I mean the media and the voters. I think the public and indeed the press are further ahead in this consideration of drugs issues than some of the politicians are. And I think when I then came out and said what I did, I was more in line with what the public thought or thinks than those who were trying to hold the line. So the interesting aspect of this whole episode, I think, for the public at large, has been the reaction, which has been by and large positive to reform. So I'm hoping that that will lead to politicians in all parties changing their positions. The Lib Dems have, we've moved on to a sensible, evidence-based, scientific-based, health-based approach, and I wait for the other 2 parties to catch up with us.
Now, it's not every day we get to hear from a former Home Office minister from this government. You said in your resignation speech there comes a point when you don't want to carry on walking through mud. Just tell us a bit about the mud.
Well, it's no secret that the Home Office is the cutting edge of the coalition. It's where the most difficult decisions and discussions take place. And I'm afraid that there wasn't necessarily a great deal of goodwill in some quarters to making the coalition work. And although I think the Home Secretary is a formidable woman and a very competent Home Secretary, I don't think she fully embraced the idea of coalition. And that meant that there were continual battles on a day-to-day basis about sometimes not very much. And that's what walking through mud is, and it shouldn't be like that.
Was it your feeling that her irritation maybe at coalition colleagues was something about her being annoyed anyway with the fight with number 10?
No, I think she just thought that she was going to run the department as a head of the department. She wanted to run a tight ship. and therefore giving ministers freedom was going to endanger that tight ship. Now, that may be a sensible philosophy for a Home Secretary. Home Secretaries don't last very long. She has, which is a tribute to her. But the flaw in the argument is that she failed to recognise as a coalition, and that dimension wasn't fully realised in the Home Office, and that's where the problems arose.
Of course, one of the reasons many people gave for switching from Labour to the Lib Dems was your opposition to the Iraq war. On the other hand, you did vote, Lib Dems did vote for the present bombing of Iraq. It's seen as very different by
Well, I didn't
Democrats.
actually personally, but
The party.
yes. Well, I mean, there is a difference between what was happening when there was a war in 2003 with no validity, no weapons of mass destruction, dodgy dossiers, and Parliament being lied to, which is what we had under Tony Blair. That's a very different proposition from a situation where a group of maniacs is running amok and killing people without any good reason, including their own citizens, and where there's UN condemnation of that.
You wrote a book a while ago about one of the pivots for war, of course, the leaks of the government scientist David Kelly. What do you think now? David Kelly, the man who tragically died, of course.
Well, I mean, I think the whole episode of 2003 is a travesty of how a democracy should operate, both in terms of how Parliament was misled about the so-called weapons of mass destruction and the way David Kelly was personally treated. And I find it astonishing that you can have someone die in such circumstances and there's not even a proper inquest. There still hasn't been an inquest into the matter. But
all the government authorities and all sides of the House seem to agree that that matter is laid to rest.
Well, all sides of the House don't want to pop their head up with a parapet. There are plenty of MPs who will say privately to me that they're concerned about that, but they don't want to say so publicly because it's too dangerous to do so.
How is it dangerous?
Well, it's dangerous because you get slaughtered by the press, as I get slaughtered by the press for raising difficult questions. I think the press need to ask themselves in this country why it is that a man can die in such circumstances. There's no inquest. The medical evidence points to the explanation officially being given as incredible, and they don't ever question that.
Norman Baker, thank you.
Thanks.
On Thursday, the Swedish Court of Appeal announced that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange would not be able to walk free from the Ecuadorian embassy in London. So what does this mean for the UK taxpayer spending money on police in Knightsbridge, for the future of WikiLeaks and for justice? Joining me via Skype from Sweden is Julian Assange's Swedish lawyer, Perry Samuelsson. Well, compared to going underground, so what does Thursday's development mean for Julian Assange?
Well, it means that for the time being he must stay in the embassy. If he leaves the embassy, he will lose his political asylum and will be arrested and transported to Sweden, where he will be put in jail in Sweden until further.
Now, the British taxpayer is footing the bill for this incarceration. Do you think the Cameron government could have done more to facilitate proceedings vis-à-vis the Swedish court?
Yes, I think this is a mess, including the UK and Sweden. Sweden has first decided that he shall be arrested in absentia, and he has then spent over 2 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, surrounded by UK police 24 hours a day, while the Swedish prosecutor remains in Sweden doing nothing. Everyone must understand that that is just rubbish, all of it.
Well, on an official basis, I guess they'd say Britain couldn't have intervened regarding this particular Swedish court decision. But do you think there were back channels, perhaps, from Britain saying this situation can't go on any longer here in central London?
I think so. I hope so, and I think that this situation must come to an end. The Swedish position is impossible. You can't keep people arrested in absentia and simultaneously refuse to conduct the pre-investigation forward. You can't say, we will wait until Julian Assange gives up, but that is exactly what they are saying. We will keep on doing nothing until he leaves the embassy, availing himself of the political asylum he has achieved and exposing himself to the risk to be extradited to the United States and receive 35 years in prison.
What about London? There weren't signs from London that they were trying to come to a decision about all of this before it had been, before any court proceeding or any kind of investigation had actually happened officially.
No, I think that the UK authorities should put pressure on the Swedish government to come to an agreement and issue warrants from both UK and Sweden, perhaps, that they will not extradite Julian Assange to the United States. That would be one solution of it. Another one, of course, that the UK would come to an agreement with the Ecuadorian authorities to grant Julian Assange free passage to Ecuador. You must remember that he has received political asylum in Ecuador. He is a political refugee, and Sweden refuses to grant that, and apparently the UK too.
David Cameron is only, in fact, within hours of the decision regarding Julian, had said he's allowing a vote about the European arrest warrant. Will that make any difference now to the plight of Julian Assange?
Well, if that new legislation would have been in force in 2012, Julian Assange would never have been extradited to Sweden. The UK courts would, in that situation, not have decided the way they did if they had that legislation in place. So this means that there is something wrong with the European arrest warrant issued by the Swedish prosecutor. And we are appealing to the Supreme Court. I've talked to Julian Assange right after the decision came Thursday in Sweden, and we have instructions to appeal to the Supreme Court in Sweden.
How is Julian taking the decision? Is he still hopeful of other avenues that may free him?
He was, of course, disappointed. You must remember that he's a human being. He has not seen fresh air for over 2 years. He's not seen his family. He can't have health care, etc., etc. But on the same time, he is very confident and looking forward to the future. And we are convinced that it's only a matter of time before the Swedish authorities will give in. And I think that the Supreme Court might have courage enough to do what the Court of Appeal did not have courage to do, namely to cancel this detention decision and face facts.
When would that decision be?
The Supreme Court decision, you mean?
Yes.
A couple of months or so. We will appeal, and then you must have permission, but I think we will have permission. It's in principle interesting case, and then they will decide upon it, and perhaps then we have the final solution of this case.
Per Samuelsson, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
And here's a quick reminder of some of what that Swedish court had to say on Thursday.
The Court of Appeal considers, like the City Court, that Julian Assange is suspected on probable cause of crimes including rape, less serious crime, and that there is a great risk that he will evade legal proceedings or punishment. In the view of the Court of Appeal, there is no reason to set aside the detention solely because Julian Assange is in an embassy, and the detention order cannot be enforced at present for that reason.
Coming up after the break, can a band really aid in the fight against Ebola? Listen more in part 2 of Going Underground. This week, parliamentary authorities in Westminster have defended their decision to ask a gardener to remove each leaf manually from the trees outside the House of Commons to save the time spent raking them up. It's the kind of decision that makes one wonder whether many people in the country even agree with the Speaker of the House of Commons, let alone MPs.
The answers from the Prime Minister haven't always been fully heard, and they must be. And the questions from the Leader of the Opposition haven't always been fully heard, and they must be. I remind the House that that's what our voters, the electorate, would expect.
Expect? Well, maybe. This week's Prime Minister's questions was so stormy that the Speaker had to intervene a few times. David Cameron had plumped for ad hominem attacks on Ed Miliband ahead of Thursday's by-election.
When it comes to the views of close colleagues, it is worth listening what the new shadow cabinet member in charge of the election, the lady, honourable lady sitting next to the shadow chancellor, said about the leader. Said this: there's a wider concern in the public about whether he's got the leadership qualities to lead his own party, let alone the country. I knew we had had moles in the Labour movement. I just didn't know they were that high up.
That's a rather disturbing reference to security service infiltration of the Labour movement by the security services, presumably. But away from the moles, Ed Miliband persevered. He raised the one left-of-centre policy some of his party are proud of: abolition of the government's bedroom tax.
He tries to defend the bedroom tax. Let me just tell him, on the bedroom tax today, the government is going to court against a victim of domestic violence who has been raped, assaulted, harassed and stalked by her ex-partner, and is going to be charged the bedroom tax on her panic room. She's one of 280 victims of domestic violence in this category. Can he just remind us why that's the right thing to do?
Cameron claimed the discretionary grant solved this problem, and as for Miliband's attempts at putting clear red water between him and the PM, this is how Cameron responded to a question about Labour's mansion tax.
In the last week, Mr. Speaker, he's been called useless, hopeless, out of his depth, doesn't cut it, and an absolute disaster. And that's just what the front bench think.
It seems that briefings by the right wing of the Labour Party against Miliband are giving Cameron plenty of one-liners.
This was the week when Mylene Klass wiped the floor with him in a television programme, and this was the week when there was an opinion poll in Scotland that showed that more people believe in the Loch Ness Monster than believe in his leadership. The only problem for the Labour Party is he does actually exist.
Mylene Klass, incidentally, is a celebrity who this week told Miliband on TV that raising tax rates on property worth over $2 million was akin to raising tax on a glass of water. But anyway, what about issues of life or death abroad?
Christians and others are being murdered for their faith in Nigeria, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan and many other countries. And elsewhere, it's a crime to believe anything but what the state sanctions. Would my right honourable friend agree that our United Kingdom stands above all for freedom of speech, thought and belief, and that we must do all in our power to protect the persecuted and stand up to the persecutors, whoever they are?
Well done, someone, for raising the plight of Christians, Jeremy Lefroy, but you conflated state action against them in very different countries. In fact, surely Britain has been helping people in Syria to kill Christians as we continue to support so-called moderate rebels. You won't find that story about persecuted Christians by UK-backed rebels on the mainstream media, though. The new Band-Aid single made £1 million within the first 4 minutes it was released. But can it solve the real problems that allowed the Ebola outbreak to ravage West Africa, or will it continue to reinforce negative stereotypes about the area? With us to discuss the issues that Band-Aid should be addressing, arguably, is the director of the World Development Movement, Nick Dearden. Welcome back, Nick. So, obviously, as the mainstream media have been covering this, it's all too easy to knock Band-Aid, Bono and Geldof. Surely some of the pain will be relieved in West Africa, in those countries affected by the single.
Well, I mean, sometimes a country does need a Band-Aid, a sticking plaster. I mean, clearly what West Africa is going through is terrible and we want to bring it to an end as fast as possible. My worry is the language that Band-Aid is using yet again to do that is actually making the problem worse, because you're completely erasing the politics of the situation. And this is what Band-Aid's been famous for 30 years now. We still have these ridiculous lyrics, do they know it's Christmas? I mean, of course they know it's Christmas in Africa. There are many Christians celebrating Christmas there. The idea that it's up to Europeans to feed the world, when actually Africa has plenty of food to feed its own people if it didn't keep exporting it for higher prices to Western markets. So for 30 years now, this kind of initiative has been erasing politics, that if we understood better, we could begin putting pressure on our governments and our multinational corporations to really prevent this kind of thing happening in the first place.
If we get onto the depoliticisation in more detail just a bit later, obviously there were lawsuits against the BBC which claimed that most of Live Aid money went to rebels in the Ethiopia-Eritrea war and other wars in the Live Aid concerts and Live Aid money. So some kind of defence there for Geldof against his money having been used by authoritarian regimes?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would, if the money had gone to the rebels, I'd be more happy. I mean, unfortunately, the majority of the money went to the government, a very authoritarian government that had actually created the famine in the first place. When Geldof stood on stage and said, this is a terrible natural disaster, I mean, that was simply a lie. I mean, it just wasn't true.
There are close ties between Bono, certainly, and the World Bank. What are the relationships here between the IMF and the World Bank and this kind of initiative?
huge relationship. I mean, the World Bank and the IMF would like us to believe that they're the good guys who are going to pour a bit of money in, and the IMF said, we'll let you off repaying some of your debts for a while this situation resolves itself. Actually, the IMF and the World Bank are up to their neck in culpability for what's happened in Sierra Leone and Liberia, especially. I mean, you know, many people think, well, there's been a terrible civil war that happened in these countries, and it was horrible and brutal. But actually, a lot of the damage had already been done by the time that war broke out, and it had been done precisely at the hands of the IMF, imposing structural adjustment policies, as it did right across Africa, and wiping out health and education systems.
Mandate 30 arguably is political, because Bono and Geldof are so close to these institutions that have created the conditions for Ebola.
Right, they're very close. And they were very close. I mean, what Bono particularly has been trying to do over the last 10 or 15 years is to put real weight behind this idea of wiping out extreme poverty. Extreme poverty was invented as a concept, really, to encourage the Republican right in the United States to support his efforts to alleviate suffering connected with HIV and so on. He said there's no way we can talk about political issues to these guys and expect them to put any money in. So he depoliticized the whole content of poverty with this notion of extreme poverty. You can be as rich as you want. You can do whatever you want in the world, and you can still care about these very, very poor people over here. So that was the whole strategy that Bono and the organisations around him pursued. For people like Geldof, he actually thinks he is a mouthpiece for the poor masses of the world. He thinks he's a mouthpiece for Africa, and the way we saw him behave, absolutely, in Glen Eagles, where African representatives were taken off panels so that Hollywood celebrities could speak on issues that they know very little about. Quite extraordinary.
And yet, does it raise the issue? I mean, people keep coming back to this idea that it does raise the issue in the public's mind. On X Factor, they wouldn't be talking about Ebola or West Africa, or they didn't mention the British troops in Sierra Leone, but they wouldn't even mention it without Geldof and Bono.
Sure, and maybe that's a problem with our media and the way that it operates, the BBC and so on, that they don't mention these issues. But I think there's better ways to do it. I mean, as I say, I'm not saying they don't have any role to play, but if you look at the role that celebrities have played for the last 50 years or so, I mean, you look at what Jane Fonda and John Lennon did around the Vietnam War. You even look as a more interesting example at what Russell Brand's saying today. I mean, that's interesting stuff, and I have no problem with them saying that stuff and raising a debate. What I think they're doing here is precisely not raising a debate. I think they're actually sitting on a debate and making it invisible through pretending that their great generosity and the great generosity of Europe is going to save these helpless African people.
And while they show these dead black bodies on their videos and so forth, how rich is Liberia? I mean, I've got a statistic, it has the highest ratio of foreign direct investments to GDP in the world, yet no health care. And Sierra Leone, again, huge amounts of investment. These are supposedly rich countries, despite the pictures on Geldof on Band-Aid's videos.
They should be, absolutely. I mean, you look at Congo as well, Democratic Republic of Congo, Republic of Congo, Liberia, Sierra Leone. These should be the richest countries in the world. I mean, the amount of minerals they've got in their soils, they should be phenomenally rich. Actually, they are all amongst the poorest countries in the world. Very, very, very poor. They're growing too. So Sierra Leone last year grew about 25%. I mean, that's an incredible rate of growth. Liberia between 10 and 15% for the last 10 years. Incredible rates of growth. Where's the wealth going? And that's the real question. That's the real political issue that these stars could put on the agenda if they wanted to. Where is that wealth going? It's being stolen. These countries are being fleeced. In the case of Sierra Leone and Liberia, by mining companies largely. British mining companies who have negotiated tax incentives that essentially mean they just simply pocket this money by the shipload. And there's no attempt for that money to reach the ordinary public through education services, health services, no attempt whatever.
It's difficult to get more grim, but British troops are in Sierra Leone helping in the Ebola crisis. What about this militarization? Because lots has been said about the American policy in Africa of militarization, of proxy war with China and so on. What are our British troops there to do in Sierra Leone as well as alleviate poverty? Or Ebola?
Well, I mean, that's an enormous concern because, of course, you're absolutely right. The Americans have been looking to militarize Africa for well over a decade now, and before that, it was already militarized through the Cold War. But I think the militarization of parts of Africa definitely shows that what they're essentially interested in is controlling this continent and the resources that it holds. And they're interested in that because that's what fuels the global economy that makes the people in charge wealthy.
The coalition have cut the aid budget, 14.5 million to this region, as far as I understand.
For those countries.
Yeah. Is that a good sign? Under David Cameron, they've cut the aid budget, or is it better to give aid?
Wealth redistribution is necessary. The problem is when aid becomes a tool for those same Western countries to impose the policies they want on Africa. And this is happening right across Africa at the moment. There are efforts underway to try to take hold of Africa's food system, to allow our corporations to come in and set up massive monoculture, industrial agricultural plantations. And it's being done in the name of helping Africans to feed themselves. But Africans have enough food. The problem
but so the government's cut in aid. Would you applaud David Cameron's cut in aid to these areas while criticising Band-Aid?
I don't applaud his cut in aid, but I say that essentially he's doing the wrong things with the aid. Increasingly, and you've seen this in West Africa as well as elsewhere, increasingly this is about privatising the public services of African countries.
Nick Dearden, thank you. That's it for today, but join us again on Monday when we speak to former number 10 advisor Ed Straw about who really decides policy in Westminster. In the meantime, drop us a line on Twitter at underground_RT, like our page on Facebook, listen to our extended interviews on SoundCloud and email us on goingunderground@rttv.co.uk. And don't forget RT UK News with Bill Dodd every weekday evening at 6, 8, 9 and 10. See you on Monday.